I want to thank both of you for being here today and making the trip to join us, and appreciate the work that you're doing to help alleviate human suffering. A question for each of you. Mr. Stiller, first of all, I'm sure as you've gone to these various places in the world where refugees are located, that you note that there are some places that are doing a better job than others. There are some countries that are doing a better job than others in helping refugees. There are some organizations that are doing a better job in providing relief. And I wondered whether UNHCR is actually, or has actually put together a, if you will, almost a handbook or a guide as to these are the best things you can do to help refugees in your country. Is there an effort, if you will, in the business world, it's called best practices, where you lay out the best practices of one enterprise to learn from it? Is that happening? And do you have a sense of the kinds of things you'd want to see in listing, these are the best things you can do to help refugees that come into your country?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm not aware if there is a specific handbook of that type or guide, but I'd refer you to my colleagues at UNHCR who I'm sure could tell you about that. I mean, I think in terms of my experience, one of the, besides the things we've been talking about, I think one of the most important aspects of this is just how people relate to refugees in the world and how they experience them. And I think right now, my concern is that there is this politicization, there's this demonization from some places of what a refugee is, this cause for fear of refugees are dangerous. And the reality is it's the opposite. Refugees are fleeing danger. And all of these people are not trying to come and invade our country or any other country. They're trying to come and just live until they can go home. And resettlement with refugees, I think, is also a big, there's a misunderstanding about that. Of the millions and millions of refugees, only I think it's 0.4% are actually resettled in a third country, 0.4% of all refugees. So I think it was 56,000 worldwide last year. So the reality is this small number are the most vulnerable, as Senator Menendez was saying, and Senator Reich were pointing out. These people are the ones who are the neediest, who are going to a third country. I think we can help by supporting organizations like UNHCR that are helping the host countries, and I think it's 85% of the refugees are going to these neighboring countries, and these countries are overwhelmed. So I think that's a huge part of it. And I'd say just attitudes towards refugees, humanizing them, seeing them as people and not something to be feared.
Thank you. Mr. Miliband, I think we were all drawn by the comments of Senator Paul, who I think correctly pointed out that civil war is one of the great causes of humanitarian crisis throughout the world, and refugees being displaced from their homes. And he raised the prospect that perhaps we should just let these things run their course and not be involved when an authoritarian ruler decides to abuse their people. Of course, the challenge with that idea is that it would send a very clear message to some of the world's worst actors that the United States of America and other nations that value human rights are not going to come to your aid. And it would make it only open the door and create a green light for some of the world's worst actors to pursue policies to oppress their people. That being said, I do wonder whether there are things that the West or other nations could have done throughout the process in Syria that would have alleviated human suffering to some degree. And I recognize that with conflict and war, there was going to be some human suffering, but the extent of it in Syria is just so overwhelming. And the humanitarian crisis that's occurred is unthinkable. And for those that have not been in the region, it's hard to communicate through words. Is there, as you stand back and look at what happened in Syria, or perhaps in other conflicts, are there lessons learned about what we could have done, if not to prevent civil war? Are there things we could have done to have made the human suffering less intense and less extensive?
Thanks very much, Senator. Can I first of all answer your first question?
Please,
because
yes.
I think your value for money point, your effectiveness point is incredibly important. Because the truth is the humanitarian enterprise has to change. Historically, it was keep people alive until they go home. That might be months or a few years. And that was relatively straightforward. They were in refugee camps, you gave them health services, you fed them, and then they went home. But last year, less than 2% of the world's refugees went home. They're displaced for, on average, if they're in a camp, 17 years. And so we can't just say we have to help them survive. They have to have the means to thrive. And I would really commend to you, we do have a guide for what to do. It's called the International Rescue Committee Outcomes and Evidence Framework. It's online. I'd urge you to type into Google IRC Outcomes and Evidence Framework, and you can see what our field managers see. It's split down across 5 outcomes because we think it's really important to be led by what are you trying to achieve. It then documents what's the evidence that we know from different humanitarian settings around the world about what works. And just in parentheses, it's tragically difficult to raise money to fund evidence-making. We know in development contexts, stable settings, that there's been a revolution in the last 20 years, largely pioneered by the Gates Foundation, to really focus on what works. There have been only about 120 evidence studies ever in the humanitarian sector. We've done about 40 of them, and we've got another 18 on the go. But you can see, if you type in IRC Outcomes and Evidence Framework, what we know, what our field managers know. And a couple of things come through very clearly. One, if you give refugees cash, you help them and you help the local population, and you diffuse tension that some people have referred to, and we can show you how much of a difference it makes. Secondly, our services are always open to host populations as well as refugees. So you don't get Lebanese or Jordanians saying, well, hang on, why is there an employment program for them but not for me? Ditto, the same thing with health services. Thirdly, half of the world's displaced people are kids. And I don't think it's wrong to talk geostrategically as well as morally about the utter short-sightedness of failing to educate generations of people who are in the midst of war, even if they're then living in stable settings. So Lebanon and Jordan, we don't have the quote-unquote excuse that it's a war zone so they can't get educated. The international community simply has not stepped up, and you will be shocked, I hope, that less than 2% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education, when half of the world's displaced people are children. So we've got huge work to do to make sure that the outcomes and the evidence are really the guide to practice. Sorry to go on about that. Have I got time to answer his next?
Go ahead. Very briefly.
It's a small subject, which is how do you stop war, so it won't take me very long.
Yeah. In a sentence.
In a sentence, I'd put one thing on the table. What's been missing throughout the Syria crisis, and is the lesson of Afghanistan, it's the lesson of Iraq, is that if you aren't clear about the political settlement that will share power in a credible and legitimate way, then no development policy, no humanitarian policy, no military strategy can ever have a clear destination. And the sentence that hasn't been filled in, frankly, in the Syrian context, is there will be a transition from President Assad, but we've never completed the sentence, what's that a transition to? We know what it's a transition from, which is autocratic rule. It's never been clear what there's a transition to. And that's been the missing link, tragically, for the last 8 years.
Thank you. Senator Murphy?